July 12th, 1943. Southern Russia. Dawn hasn't fully broken, but the horizon already glows with distant fire. In a narrow strip of land barely 5 miles wide, squeezed between the Psel River on one side and a railway embankment on the other, two of the most powerful armored forces ever assembled are seconds away from impact. Over 1,500 tanks, engines idling, crews gripping controls, hearts pounding inside steel hulls that will soon become coffins for many of them. There is no space for tactics as they were taught, no room to flank, no room to retreat, only forward, only impact, only survival. What is about to unfold here will not look like war as the world understands it. It will look like chaos, fire, metal colliding at point-blank range. This is the Battle of Prokhorovka, a clash so violent, so compressed, that even decades later historians struggle to fully agree on what really happened here and who actually won. To understand how the world arrived at this moment, we need to step back, not days, but months. The early months of 1943 marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. Just months earlier, the German Sixth Army had been annihilated at Stalingrad. Over 300,000 men lost in one of the most devastating defeats in military history. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility had been shattered. But despite this, Germany was not finished, not even close. Adolf Hitler and his generals believed they could still regain the initiative. They identified a weakness in the Soviet lines, a massive bulge known as the Kursk salient. It stretched hundreds of miles, packed with Soviet troops and equipment. If they could cut it off from the north and south simultaneously, they could encircle and destroy an entire Soviet army. The plan was called Operation Citadel, and it would become one of the largest offensives of the entire war. On paper, Operation Citadel was elegant, precision, coordination, a perfect pincer movement, designed to crush the enemy in one decisive blow. But there was a fatal flaw, one that would define everything that followed. The Soviets already knew it was coming. Through an intricate web of intelligence networks, including spies deep inside German planning circles, Soviet command had access to detailed information about the attack months before it began. And instead of reacting in panic, they prepared. They transformed the Kursk salient into something the world had never seen before, a fortress layered with defenses in depth, millions of landmines buried beneath the soil, hundreds of miles of trenches zigzagging across the landscape, anti-tank ditches designed to trap advancing armor, artillery positions calibrated with terrifying precision. The Red Army wasn't waiting to be attacked. They were preparing to absorb the blow and then break it. By the time July arrived, the stage was set. On the southern edge of the salient, one of the most elite formations in the German military began its advance, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. This was not an ordinary force. It consisted of hardened veterans, divisions that had been fighting since the earliest days of the war. The Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf. These units were heavily equipped, highly trained, and driven by an almost fanatical discipline. At their core was one of the most feared weapons of the war, the Tiger I tank, weighing over 50 tons, armed with the devastating 88mm gun. It could destroy enemy tanks from distances where it couldn't even be touched in return. Against most opponents, the Tiger dictated the fight before it even began. And leading this force was General Paul Hauser, a commander known for aggression and battlefield adaptability. Facing them was a very different kind of force. The Soviet defenders in this sector were under the command of General Nikolai Vatutin. As German armor pushed forward, grinding through defensive lines with brutal efficiency, Vatutin made a critical decision. He called in one of the most powerful reserves available, the 5th Guards Tank Army. This was not a defensive force, it was a hammer, and it was commanded by General Pavel Rotmistrov, a man who believed that hesitation meant defeat. His army consisted of around 850 tanks, the majority of them T-34s. These machines were fast, reliable, and easier to produce, but they were outmatched in direct, long-range combat against German heavy armor. Rotmistrov understood this perfectly, so instead of fighting the enemy's battle, he decided to change the rules entirely. Rotmistrov's plan was as bold as it was terrifying. If his tanks couldn't win at long range, they would eliminate distance entirely, close the gap, collapse the battlefield into chaos, engage at such short distances that the German advantage would disappear. His orders were simple: advance at full speed, break into the German formations, fight at point-blank range. It was not just a tactical decision, it was a calculated sacrifice. He knew the cost would be enormous, but if it worked, it could halt the German advance cold. In essence, what he planned was something rarely seen in modern warfare: a direct armored charge, not maneuver warfare, not defensive positioning, a charge, like cavalry, but with steel beasts weighing dozens of tons, roaring across open ground toward an enemy just as deadly. The morning of July 12th began under a heavy fog, the kind that blurs shapes and distorts distance. Soviet artillery opened fire before sunrise, pounding German positions relentlessly. Explosions tore into the earth, shaking the ground beneath both armies. Then, at approximately 8:30 a.m., the order was given. Over the radio came the signal: "Steel, steel, steel." And with that, the Soviet tanks surged forward. Hundreds of engines roared to life simultaneously. Tracks clawed at the dry summer soil. The earth trembled under their weight. From the German side, armored units were already advancing as well. And within minutes, the two forces collided head-on. There was no gradual escalation, no probing attacks, just immediate, violent contact, a collision of mass and momentum, unlike anything the battlefield had ever seen before. What followed defied conventional warfare. The battlefield was too tight, too crowded, too chaotic for structured tactics. Tanks fired at each other from distances as close as 50 meters, in some cases, even closer. Visibility dropped as smoke from burning vehicles filled the air, turning the battlefield into a choking haze of fire and ash. Crews struggled to identify targets. Friend and foe blurred together in the confusion. Some tanks rammed into each other deliberately, trying to disable their opponents through sheer force. Others fired blindly into the smoke, hoping to hit something before being hit themselves. The sound was deafening. Constant gunfire, explosions, the grinding of metal, the screams of men trapped inside burning machines. It was not a battle. It was a storm of destruction compressed into a few square miles. Despite the overwhelming chaos, certain patterns began to emerge. The German tanks, with their superior optics and firepower, still managed to inflict devastating losses. But their advantage was reduced. At such close distances, even a T-34 could penetrate the side armor of a Tiger. The Soviets, in turn, relied on sheer numbers and relentless aggression. Wave after wave pressed forward, refusing to break even as losses mounted. By midday, the battlefield had transformed into a graveyard of steel. Hundreds of tanks burned simultaneously. sending thick black smoke spiraling into the sky. The ground was littered with wreckage. Crews who escaped destroyed vehicles often found themselves caught in the open, exposed to gunfire from both sides. Survival became a matter of seconds, not minutes. By the time the fighting finally began to subside, the scale of destruction was almost unimaginable. The Soviets had lost hundreds of tanks, estimates ranging between 350 and 400 destroyed or disabled. The German losses were significantly lower, around 70 tanks, many of which could later be repaired. On a purely tactical level, the outcome seemed clear. The Germans had held their ground and inflicted heavier losses. But war is rarely decided by numbers alone, because while the battle at Prokhorovka raged, events elsewhere were already reshaping the bigger picture. News reached Hitler that Allied forces had landed in Sicily. A new front had opened in the west. Resources were needed urgently, and suddenly, the offensive in the east was no longer the top priority. On July 13th, just one day after the battle, Operation Citadel was officially called off. The German advance stopped. Units that had fought so hard at Prokhorovka were ordered to withdraw. The Soviets, despite their staggering losses, seized the initiative. Within weeks, they launched counteroffensives that pushed German forces back across the front. Cities were retaken. Momentum shifted permanently. From that point forward, Germany would never again mount a major strategic offensive in the east. Prokhorovka, in isolation, may look like a tactical German success, but in the broader context of the war, it marked the beginning of the end of German dominance on the Eastern Front. And that is what makes Prokhorovka so haunting. It challenges the way we think about victory and defeat. The Soviets lost more tanks, more men, suffered catastrophic damage, and yet they emerged on the path to ultimate victory. The Germans, meanwhile, demonstrated tactical superiority, but lost the strategic initiative forever. It is a reminder that war is not just about who wins the fight in front of them. It's about who can endure, adapt, and continue when the fight moves elsewhere. For the men who were there, none of this mattered in the moment. There was no grand strategy in the smoke and fire, only survival, only the next second, only the hope of making it out alive. The Battle of Prokhorovka lasted less than a single day, less than 12 hours of sustained combat, but in that short span of time, thousands of lives were lost, and the trajectory of a global conflict shifted. It remains one of the most intense and controversial battles ever fought. Historians still debate the details, the numbers, the outcome. But perhaps the most important question isn't who won or lost. It's what it reveals about the nature of war itself. Because sometimes the battlefield doesn't give clear answers. Sometimes both sides walk away believing something different. And sometimes the true outcome is only understood years later when the smoke has long since cleared